Hello everyone, welcome back. Apologies for a very short break, but that gives us more opportunity to have questions at the end of the session, so please keep those coming. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome John Kedar to our panel, and he will be talking about arguably the most important pillar of the IGIF around people, Strategic Pathways 7, 8 and 9, and all about the importance of our human resource. John, thank you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Greg, and good day to everyone wherever you are. We're all here because we believe that geospatial adds real value in our nations, in our businesses, and to society at large. And we all know that actually around the world there are barriers to success. And these were talked about in the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework Part 1, the overarching strategic framework. And as you scan through some of those, you'll notice most of them are actually about people and winning arguments and encouraging and indeed persuading people to pull through these barriers. And so this is why the people barrier, the people pillar is so important. And the people pillar, as you can see here, is the partnerships, capacity and education, and communications and engagement. And before I go into each of these in turn, let's just pick up some examples. So on the partnerships side, there is a program at the moment called Common Sensing. It's working with 3 Pacific islands, but the partnership is with the islands, but also the United Nations, funders, industry, and academia. And they're all working together with the common goal of trying to build resilience in the islands to the devastating impacts of climate change. So partnerships, very real. Capacity and education, and Leslie talked a lot about the importance of education in helping us bridge the digital divide. I don't really need to say much more about it, but we do know, and it's really important to stress, and the World Bank and the United Nations both make clear, that digitization is not just about technology, but good governance, good business climate, and good skills. The third, which is very real everywhere in the world at the moment, COVID-19 and health. And what we've seen through COVID-19 is the importance of communication in our nations and indeed globally. And actually we've seen geospatial used to help with that communications effort with these dashboards that have appeared around the world. But interestingly, the dashboards have gone further in some countries and are the means of communicating control measures to populations, particularly where those control measures differ from city to city. So let's move on from those examples and look at the implementation guide in more detail. And we'll start with Strategic Pathway 8, capacity and education. And there is logic in starting with this one first. Given the rapid pace of technological change, keeping up to speed in all nations is incredibly difficult. And I think we need to consider all 4 elements of this pathway together in order to really understand how we're going to improve capacity and education. So the first one is awareness. And industry's helped us. The apps on our smartphones has helped us enormously with awareness. But actually people don't necessarily associate that with the geospatial community, and we need them to help. We need to help them do exactly that. The second is formal education, and that's not just university degrees. It's right from primary school and using the web, using geospatial technologies in classes right the way through to graduates. And not just geospatial graduates, but geospatial being part of so many other courses as well. The third, professional training, a whole life approach given the rapid pace of change. And employers, professional bodies, and individuals, we all have a part to play in that. And the fourth element under capacity and education is entrepreneurship. Developing the ethos of entrepreneurship, helping entrepreneurs. Now in UK and Singapore, actually, there are hubs designed specifically to do that, partnering with industry. But it can be as simple as providing free data licenses or support to entrepreneurs, but helping that ethos of entrepreneurship using geospatial. So those are the four elements of capacity and education. And as Leslie's described, there are a set of actions for each of these strategic pathways. And here are the ones for capacity and education. And you'll see here, setting direction, assessing needs, considering alternatives, planning, taking action, and assessing value. The key thing, though, is we're trying to establish an enduring capacity here with our education. There's no point in just training people once. We're trying to change the system in what we do so that it is as strong in the future as we can make it. And there are tools too, and Leslie's talked about the tool sets, but I draw this one particularly because if we're looking at something long term, we need a strategy for our capacity and education. And one of the tools is about building the strategy and suggesting some particular topics to consider within the strategy. And that's the level of detail that the IGIF implementation guide goes into. Just the people pillar has 138 pages of knowledge, information, tools, assistance to help nations moving forward. And we have a set of outcomes shown on the bottom left here. We're trying to improve awareness, increase adoption, stimulate innovative solutions, and generally increase geospatial knowledge, skills. Now, education is clearly done in partnerships. And so I'm going to move on to Strategic Pathway 7 partnerships second. And here we can see the Sustainable Development Goals, of which number 17 is partnerships. But underpinning the whole of Vision 2030 is a need for partnerships. It's one of the 5 pillars for Vision 2030. And it's just the same with the IGIF. Partnerships is absolutely critical. The forming of the IGIF was done with a global partnership of people from every continent, working, as Greg has said, for 2 years, quite intensively, to pull together what we have in front of us today. And that's achieved an awful lot more than just the raw partnerships, because it's brought together an increased capacity amongst all those that have taken part. We have built our knowledge. It's expanded UN-GGIM expertise and proficiency generally, and it's brought creativity and innovation to the fore. And these are all outcomes desired by this particular strategic pathway. So there are 4 elements with this pathway. There are 4 elements with every strategic pathway. International global collaboration we've talked upon, but it's also regional collaboration too. And there are some fantastic examples: INSPIRE in the European Union, AFREF in Africa, the International Centre for Integrated Mountain Development, SDI, in the Himalayas, 8 nations coming together on a regional basis to try and do something. And those regional partnerships may well be more important than the global ones in some respects. At a national level, we know that the private sector and academic collaboration is absolutely vital. Academia brings deep expertise into a partnership. An industry can bring capacity beyond straight contracting arrangements because the rapid paces of changing of technology means that we can perhaps trust industry to partner and help us keep and de-risk our projects and reduce the cost of our projects in trying to deliver geospatial information to our nations. Cross-sector and interdisciplinary cooperation. That's within a nation, and that's cross-government cooperations, and it can be informal workshops right the way through to getting together to solve a particular problem, such as, an easy one to choose, flood risk management, which is a collaboration across several departments and may need and mean that we in our own areas have to change our activities as a result of that partnership. And the fourth is community participation. And that's the involvement of community groups, helping them use geospatial to solve their particular problems. Now, the IGIF has, as Leslie says, a load of principles. And here are some principles specifically around partnering. And I think what's most important here, out of all of them, is the need with partners for a joint vision and joint goals. We're all needing to achieve the same joint outcome. As individual organisations, we might have different internal objectives, but we must come together with one set of joint goals. And there are a set of partnering actions, and they're shown here. What's most important, I think, is actually we must formalise partnerships. Ad hoc partnerships will do for some purposes, but in reality, we must formalise. We must know how we're going to govern them, and we must know how we're going to manage them. And if they don't work, how we're going to conclude a partnership. And we must do so with the right partners. But I want to just touch on briefly the first box, understanding partnerships. There are many opportunities for partnering. And if we just take a couple of them here, data partnerships, the creation of data and how we're going to achieve that. Capacity development, how we partner to improve the capacity of our organisations and the nation writ large. And research and innovation, how do we bring academia, industry, our own government organisations together to encourage that entrepreneurship that is so vital to what we are doing. And there are many types of partnering, and I'm not going to look at these different types in any detail, but the question in our minds is, how do we know what we should be partnering on? How do we determine the need for partnering? And it starts with the interrelations that are shown in the implementation guide. And these are really important. And for SP7, for partnering opportunities, there are many interrelations with other strategic pathways that will give us the needs potentially that are answered by partnering. They give us the opportunities. And I'll show this on this diagram here. So with SP7, with partnerships, we have a need to look at some of the other pathways as shown here. But if we then take this up to a new level, and this is representative, you see how interrelated the different elements of the IGIF implementation guide really are. And that absolutely is why the jigsaw puzzle was used to show the 9 pathways. It is an integrated solution. Now, moving on to the third pathway I want to cover, communication and engagement. And I'm starting with the interrelationships here, and I'm doing it deliberately because communication engagement has 2 key interrelationships. One is with governments and institutions. And for those that were listening in last week, Greg actually suggested that governance and institutions and communications and engagement were the 2 bookends, if you like, for the 9 pathways. And they are absolutely linked. But so too, and I'll explain why, financial pathway and communications and engagement. So here's a challenge that we have in many countries. We're not raising the bar. We're not getting that awareness out there. And actually the aim with Pathway 9, the outcomes, are to achieve exactly that. No one is saying it is easy. It's absolutely not. But the pathway, the strategic Pathway 9, is there to help us achieve that. So those are the outcomes we are trying to achieve here. We speak our own language, top left. Everyone else speaks a very different language. And we know that we find it very difficult to turn into other people's, but we must. We must learn the language of those that we are trying to influence and turn our messages into that particular language. And I think this is really important, and it's very difficult. And we may have to consider bringing in experience into our organisations to support us with this. We're trying to achieve the light bulb moment, aren't we? And in fact, we're trying to achieve a lot of light bulb moments in our individual nations. And I think the four elements of communications and engagement are aiming to help us do that. And you can see the four elements up here. Once again, the strategic pathway takes us through a number of actions. And I do want to just dwell on a few of those in a second. But just pulling through, it's around leadership, providing leadership, and that may well be with partners. We've got to understand the opportunities we have, who are the key stakeholders that we need to tackle, and what messages then that we need to put together under setting direction. We've got to have a plan of action. This isn't haphazard, although at times we will have to take the initiative when something comes along that gives us a new opportunity. Monitoring progress. Now, we monitor progress with all the strategic pathways. But the difference here is communication. We have to monitor incredibly closely to see whether our messages are effective, whether we're getting through to people and making any progress. And communication, of course, is absolutely two-way. And the last thing is we've got to understand the values that we're trying to communicate. So if I pick up on some of those specifically, under providing leadership, we have internal communications. And I think it's really important for us all to understand we have to bring our people with us. The amount of change in what we're trying to do, even with small steps, the amount of change is considerable. So we have to have an internal communications program to bring people in our organisations with us, encourage them, and actually get them really embarked in this change. We need to identify key stakeholders, and we will think long and hard about who those might be. And there'll be those that have a real interest in what we do, and those that can really influence the outcomes we are trying to achieve. And we would all love the Minister of Finance for our countries to be in that top right-hand box, high influence and high interest. The trouble is, they're invariably in the top left-hand box, high influence but low interest. And so our planning, our thinking will be about how do we shift it into that top right box. But the second thing that we need to think about here is there will be people in the high influence, high interest box, potentially ministers, and we need to think about how we really use their abilities, their position as champions. And Greg and others have talked about champions, but they may well sit up at that top right-hand side, and we can capitalise upon it. The third thing I want to touch on is the need for consistent, relevant, strategic messages. And we've heard of many of them, and some of them are shown on the screen. Digital scaffolding used at the United Nations World Geospatial Information Congress just 18 months ago, as an example. In UK, it was the Treasury that worked out that there was vast sums of unrealised economic value to UK across 5 sectors. And they created the Geospatial Commission, as Talia mentioned last week, specifically on the back of that message. And under monitoring, we need to also think about meaningful and timely intervention, because there will be times when intervention for some crisis or something else really gives us an opportunity. Now, this quote is Bill Gates, and it's back in 2018, but how relevant it is today. And we need to ask ourselves, does COVID-19 give us a new opportunity, another opportunity for our messaging, and when should we address that? When should we launch and make that known? And the last point here is communicating value. There are many, many values that geospatial can bring a nation, And the important thing here is we need to understand them. We also need to understand where case studies have worked in our own nations and similar nations, so that we have a library, if you like, of material that we can use for our messages. And I want to link that communicating value back to Strategic Pathway 3, the finance one that Tim talked about, and country level action plans, because this is where we really understand the benefits to our own particular country. And once we have those, key is clearly communicating them. So that's the people pillar. I'm not going to say anything more. I leave that as a summary of what it really is about. It's probably the greatest difference to spatial data infrastructures, because this is really about the people that we have working with us, the partnerships, and the need to communicate and engage with those parts of society that can improve the geospatial elements of our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Much appreciated. Okay, folks, we've now had the opportunity to hear our presenters give a moderately detailed overview of the implementation guide of the IGIF. And if I may now, I'd like to take the opportunity to use some of your questions, the many questions that you've sent in, to pose to our distinguished panel. And I guess I'd like to start off with an item that's being covered across all three presentations, and is reflected in the questions as well. And it comes down to leadership, to champions, to political awareness, to commitment, and all of what goes with that. And so the question being is, as we recognise how important these attributes of the IGIF are, I'm going to ask Tim first, given the governance pathway, is how do you see, or what's the importance or value of the IGIF on how it addresses the need for raising political awareness and commitment? In other words, how do we garner and maintain our champions for the future? So your thoughts, Tim, please.
Thanks, Greg. This is an opportunity to show what we have. We have a tremendous amount of capability. We have lots of data. And the question is, how do we best use that? And for those that are in positions of authority and power and decision-making, they can benefit from the information that we have available to us. And I think you begin that dialogue with showing what you have, showing how it can help, showing how it can advance the country or meet those national needs or those national circumstances. So if I play on John's suggestion or example with the COVID-19 situation that we're in today, we could spend a lot of time looking back in terms of how we got here, but I think it's better in our environment to look forward. We know that at some point we're going to have inoculation. At some point, it's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be next month, but sometime in the relatively near future, there will be some capability to begin taking action on that. If you're a leader, you're not going to be able to inoculate everyone at one time. It's not possible. So how do you then organize yourselves? Do you go to the elderly? Do you go to the frontline workers for healthcare? Do you go to children? Do you go to the poor, which may not have access to the same level of healthcare as others do? These are decision points that leaders need to make. But you are sitting on geospatial information combined with statistical information, the integrated part of this, that can show where these groups of people live, where they congregate, where they may work. That's an example of how you can show through products that you have to help decision makers learn about the value of what you have to offer. And another example in that same construct is that we are all suffering from the economic downturn. That's not going to continue forever either. So how do we know when business starts up, when manufacturing starts up, where are the workers, where are the jobs? This is going to be a slow process. And as we go through that process, having the geospatial information combined with the economic data that's made available helps decision makers plan for the next week or the next month or the next year. So we, using SP9 on communication, have to show our leaders what we have to offer, show them examples of what's possible, even with what I'll call example data or dummy data, just to show what's possible, even though those numbers may not be accurate at the moment, just to show how they can then use those tools to advance their ideas. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. And you mentioned there with SP9, and I wanted to actually follow up with John. And I guess this is a question that's come in to I guess consider the role of the private sector, and it's also important that we, I guess, recognise the fact that there's different parts of our community, whether it be industry, the private sector, NGOs and others, that also have a role in, I guess, being champions of understanding and the awareness. So a question for you, John, is how do you see the private sector contributing to this leadership and the champions cause and the capabilities that help support that?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And I will answer that as best I can. But I just pick up on Tim's point. It's about how we solve their problems, the leaders' problems. And actually, industry will also be trying to solve the leaders' problems, the customers' problems. It's not about selling a black box, it's about actually solving problems. And I think industry, academia, government all will take the same approach. But how do we engage private sector in helping us with this messaging, helping us with leadership? Most nations have professional bodies or associations, and globally there are organizations such as the United Nations Private Sector Network or the World Geospatial Industry Council. There are organizations that actually we as government organizations need to interact with, because they can help us with our message. They have a good story to tell. They're providing solutions that can help tell the same stories. And since COVID-19 is all the rage, in a number of countries it's been interesting to see how with these dashboards all right the way through to actually predicting where resources are going to have to be moved in order to cope with an outbreak that's likely to happen in 2 weeks' time, we see geospatial industry, national geospatial organizations, and often data science community starting to work together in partnership, because solving a lot of these problems does require that partnership. So in summary, Greg, it's a matter of all of us engaging with our industry associations in our own countries or our professional bodies, trying to help our professional bodies move potentially and adapt to the new requirements of the geospatial information age. But it's about those relationships that will help us with our arguments with leadership.
Thanks, John. I will put, if you don't mind, I will put each of you on notice, all three of you on notice too, because one of the questions I'd like to come back to later on is as we talk about some of these issues in leadership and the value of that is how we then reflect on this in terms of developing countries, particularly the least developed countries who are, as you know better than most, are incredibly challenged in the dynamic environment of I guess, governance and leadership, and that's something that we're very cognizant of. So just as a bit of a provocative thought, we'll come back to that. Leslie, I wanted to just pick up, and a couple of questions came in on your slide that looked at, I guess if I can call it, these 5 phases, where we go from analog right through NSDIs to the IGIF and some of the process in that. But I guess some of the questions would be around, well, perhaps that's an incremental approach, and there may be ways that we focus, particularly developing countries, focus on an incremental approach as they transition through this journey across a number of critical strategic pathways. And it may be that the technology pathway is one that's a little bit more structured to enable that. I just thought if you could sort of think about how that transition may apply, particularly through those last two phases of NSDI to IGIF, any particular advice you might have to countries as we look at how we do this.
Thanks, Greg. So yes, it does look like it's incremental. So firstly, if I can just say, in that diagram, I don't know if we can bring it up, down the side there's a number of different areas, and it doesn't mean that a country has to be in level 1 for all those different aspects. So in terms of acquisition, there might be a level 1 in terms of analog mapping, but they may have skills and capability at level 2 or 3. So I just wanted to make that point. So moving from the SDI to the integrated geospatial information framework is still about having that strategy and that plan to progress. Yes, in some cases it is an incremental process, and I mentioned about the cadastral mapping, going from hard copy maps, moving into digitisation of those maps, and then leveraging that cadastral data in a way through an SDI by integrating it. And then, of course, that cadastral information, once it is digitised, can actually be used in terms of these knowledge on demand applications or applications such as real estate. So sometimes it's incremental, and in other cases you can leapfrog. So if you are a country that wants to collect, for example, building footprints, and you don't have any data, there is imagery available now that you can run these automated feature extraction software. So in that instance, you're not touching anywhere near analog or digitisation. You're going straight through to developing these intelligent data sets. So there's an ability to leapfrog. So it comes back to planning, thinking about what your goals are you're trying to achieve, and yeah, I guess it does come back to having a good strategy in place and knowing what you need. Did that answer your question?
No, it did. Thanks, Leslie. It's appreciated, and I guess part of the challenge too is, and this is coming back to another question, was that it could be that countries start their journey in different areas on the puzzle, the 9 strategic pathways, and it could be that even though we may be talking about starting with governance or institutional arrangements, there could be other factors, and certainly if, for example, we do have, particularly in many developed countries, those governance arrangements and processes are very well established, and a key part to that, I think, would then be around the technology pillar and also the people pillar as well, in terms of sustaining some of this. So I think that's something we need to think about as well, and we've discussed this actually in solving the puzzle to some degree. I want to just turn a little bit now to a couple of questions that have been, I guess, talking about a little bit more on NSDIs and the difference and where we're heading with things like IGIF maturity and where data and technology is moving and how that has an impact, or the lack of being able to bridge the geospatial digital divide does have an impact there, and that's something we're very conscious of. Leslie, any thoughts on how, I guess, and I'm starting with you, Leslie, but it can go to all three of you. When we think about bridging the geospatial digital divide, there's so many parts to it. Part of it is about capability, it's about capacity, it's about awareness, it's about having resources, governance, but even the most basic around, as you've mentioned already, Leslie, having the ability to connect to the world, having the ability to leverage technology, having the ability to leapfrog. If I could just get, I guess, two key points from each of you is to perhaps what are the key advantages, and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot here, but a couple of key points on how the IGIF and the implementation guide through each of those three pillars, and if you can talk against each of your pillars separately, help support this bridging of the geospatial digital divide. So Leslie first, and then I'll follow up with Tim and then John.
Thanks, Greg. I almost want to steal from Tim's pillar, though, if that's okay, because the key thing is having to bridge that digital divide. The key thing is having the support at a political and at a higher level to recognise that there's a need. For me, that's the first critical thing. And not only that, it's about, and we talk about the governance model, and it's about engaging a number of different sectors as well. So in the action plan, quite often you have different activities, and it's okay to have leads in those activities. Getting that buy-in and letting other people be the champions is really important. What you want me to talk about? Innovation. I think that having that innovation culture is a key one for me as well. And how to build that is by firstly enabling data to be accessible. And I'm stealing from Tim again. It's about having access to data, and that comes from having a more open data policy, having access, allowing people to engage with that data and be creative is really important as well, because quite often it's the university students who will actually take the data and be creative and take a country on a journey from not having something to having something. So I think that's my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Tim, have you got anything to come back with?
Well, no, actually, I mean, I'll use an example if I can. So the situation that we're in at the moment has turned the globe upside down. So take a topic like education. Now we're all sequestered in our homes globally with children in the home, and schools have stopped, and now there's a complete dependence on connections with students, usually in this case via the web. Well, if we're looking at developing countries, this is an interesting challenge for us in terms of basic infrastructure. In order to ask the question, and this is true not just for developing countries, but this is also a problem in the most developed countries where internet access is not equal. It's not necessarily complete. So the basic question from a geospatial perspective is, where do you serve these connections? It's at the household, it's at the business location. This is all location-based data. From there, you can identify where the best access or the best internet connection service might be possible. So now you have a situation where you can know where you have your gaps, where you have your capabilities, and from there you can begin building on the private sector side, building those tools that are necessary to make it possible for people in their homes, people in their businesses. Teleworking, for example, has become a major component of our day-to-day existence today. So those are examples of how, from the geospatial perspective, a leader needs to know the answer to the question, where are the gaps? Where are the holes in the connectivity, the basic services that are needed? And from there, once you have those connectivities, we're in an internet world today, that helps with business development. Individuals can start up private small businesses to be able to expand and explore. Without those connections, that's just not going to be possible. So that's an example of how we can bridge that digital divide in terms of a common problem, a common solution as we go forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. John, anything just to add on that?
I think everyone has pinched the people pillar there. So let me just pick up on education, because I think really, really important that we use our young people more in our organisations. The young have been educated differently. They have different skills. They have a different way of thinking, and so we must embrace the energy and the knowledge that they have. So that's a people issue. I think the second, and that means bravery. We've got to be brave in a sense, because we've got to bring people, we've got to encourage them, bring them up to board level, potentially decision-making level, when they're still young, and that applies across the whole of the digital industry, not just ours, obviously. Education, we have global resources now, and Tim talked a lot about the internet and connectivity. Where that connectivity is possible, then absolutely, some of these global resources can help us educate all of us, and we should drive on that. And I suspect we've all attended, if we have connectivity, an awful lot more webinars in the last 2 months than we had in the last 2 or 3 years. As we're trying to learn more, we have the opportunity to learn more. The second thing to me is around, we can't solve all the problems at once. Clearly not. And in countries that are on the least developed, in a sense, digitally, we've perhaps got to focus on 1 or 2 problems that we can solve, and to do so with other stakeholders across the community. And it may be a resilience challenge. It may be a city or urban planning challenge. But we've got to perhaps try, rather than try and do everything, focus in on one particular challenge and show that we can help solve those problems. And it doesn't mean that we've got to be at level 5 in Leslie's diagram. It just means we've got to share data, and we've got to work with others to try and solve a problem. Because then we actually encourage others to use and see the value we bring, and things start to flow.
Thanks, John. Much appreciated, folks. I haven't forgotten the question on the developing countries either, and I'll come back to that, because we will have another Q&A session after the break, after we've had our 2 presentations from Bayamar and from David. So colleagues, we are now going to take a very short 5-minute break yet again. And then in 5 minutes' time, we will come back and we will see some two brilliant examples of how the country-level action plans are being implemented in countries, the 2 countries of Mongolia and Guyana. And following that, we will have another question and answer session where we will continue on questions and pick up on new ones as we conclude the session. So in 5 minutes, we will come back. Thank you for the questions so far. We're sitting at just over 42 at the moment, and keep them coming, because they're very valuable for us, even if we don't get to all of them. Thank you, and back with you very, very soon.